Selamat datang di Faris Channel. Bangsa Cina telah lama dikenal sebagai bangsa dengan tingkat pengetahuan yang tinggi. Bahkan, kita sebagai umat Islam pada zaman dahulu diibaratkan untuk mencari ilmu sampai ke negeri Cina. Video berikut menggambarkan kedalaman pengetahuan bangsa Cina dan memperlihatkan kegigihan mereka dalam mencari solusi bagi suatu persoalan yang mereka hadapi. Selamat menyaksikan.
China's engineers had their work cut out to deliver on this bold plan. 50 kilometers outside Gomud, Pasilautala begins his mission to find out how Chinese engineers solved the first challenge of this extreme terrain. To reach the plateau, they first had to cross the formidable peaks of the Qianlong Mountains. The old Tibetan highway runs close to the new railway, giving Pasi the chance to drive the route.
Well, when you see these cool mountains with the snowy tops, it's no longer surprising it took 50 years to build this railway line up here. Quite magnificent.
Cars and lorries can cope with steep climbs, but heavy trains need a slow, gradual ascent, what engineers call a steady gradient.
Well, they chosen this route because this goes kind of between the mountain tops. They are following the valley between, and that's the easiest way to maintain the smooth gradient.
But going straight up the valley is out of the question. The gradient is too steep. So the railway must zigzag up it, crossing time and time again, with literally dozens of bridges. Two-thirds of the way up the valley, the engineers faced an enormous challenge, building the Sanchaha Bridge, the tallest bridge on the whole route.
Right here we are crossing the river valley, so we have to maintain the railway up in the air so that we can keep the smooth gradient.
It's a critical structure that had to be completed quickly so they could get supplies up to the plateau by rail to build the rest of the railway. And that meant working through the winter. By throwing an army of workers at the job and keeping the concrete warm when temperatures plunged to -20, they managed to construct the bridge in just 12 months. The deadline was met.
Wow, this is fantastic. I'm quite happy I got off the train. And I can't even imagine how it was to build this bridge over the winter time. Just amazing.
But this was just the beginning. As Pasi heads over the Qianlong Mountains, up to the cold, thin air of the Tibetan plateau, he's about to discover an extraordinary natural phenomenon that destroys towns. After crossing the Qianlong Mountains, day breaks for the passengers on board the T-27 train from Beijing to Lhasa. It brings with it spectacular views of the Tibetan plateau.
I had dreamed to come to Tibet for many years and see the scenery from the many books, and the scenery is far more better than what we imagine and from the book actually. Yeah, so it's really great. Yeah.
This incredible area is so vast and cold, it's been called the Third Pole. It stretches over 2.5 million square kilometers, a quarter of the area of China. Winter temperatures plunge to -35 degrees Celsius. And the entire area is higher than the Matterhorn. For railway engineers like Pasi Lautala, this is about as tough as it gets.
If I was asked to build a railway over these mountains, I would probably run away. I don't think you can find much more of a challenge than doing something like that.
Actually, you can. Because below the flat surface of the plateau lies a substance that for 50 years defeated all attempts to build a railway. Frozen earth. Permafrost.
Well, the permafrost can have depth of a few meters or all the way up to like 50 or 60 meters. And most of the permafrost stays frozen year round.
The problem is not the permanent permafrost deep in the ground, but a layer of soil and water above it, the active layer that freezes in winter and thaws in summer.
In winter, the ground is frozen solid, but if I was here in the summertime, it would be like walking on a bog or a swamp.
The effects of the winter freeze can easily be demonstrated.
It's getting quite chilly here, so we're going to have a little experiment. I have a full bottle of water, and I'm going to leave it here. We'll come back and see what's happened to it. And here's the result of our experiment. As water freezes, it expands by about 9%. Now this landscape is full of water, which behaves the same way as the water in the bottle.
Over decades, the ground here can shift several meters. It's a problem that the locals have struggled with for centuries. As Pasi finds out on his first stop on the plateau, the small town of Wudaoliang, where the locals had been having a bit of a problem with their foundations.
Many of the buildings in this town show damage from permafrost. Once the ground gets moving from freezing and thawing, almost nothing can stop it.
As the ground rises and falls, it's pulling the town to pieces.
I mean, take a look at these cracks in this building. This is a great example of what permafrost can do in the buildings.
Tough for buildings, the movement of the permafrost makes it impossible to build a railway. As the builders of this line in Alaska and these lines in Canada found out the hard way. So Chinese engineers were expected to somehow solve the unsolvable. This nightmare problem landed on the desk of cold region scientist Guo Dongqiang, who quickly ruled out the obvious conventional solution.
The problem with this idea is that it involves a tremendous amount of work. You have to dig out all the foundation soil, remove all the ice, and finally fill it with rocks.
Over half the planned route across the Tibetan Plateau crossed permafrost, 632 kilometers in all. Building deep foundations into the permafrost on such a vast scale was just too much labor and too much cost, even for the Chinese. Then came a revelation. The solution had been staring Cheng in the face, right here on the plateau. The locals had figured out that the biggest problem for their houses was that the heat inside melted the ground below, causing subsidence. Their solution was to build their houses on stilts, or put pipes between the building and the ground to allow air to flow through. Cheng realized that this kept the ground below the houses frozen. It was a eureka moment. If he could keep the ground below the railway frozen, then it wouldn't subside.
I think the most important issue regarding the railway is the idea that we must change from maintaining the temperature to reducing the temperature. This is essential.
To try out this idea, in the 1970s, Cheng's team built a research station up on the plateau at Beiyue. They built a test section of the railway embankment and started to experiment.
So here we have ventilation ducts, which are just hollow pipes that run through the embankment. In the winter, they allow cold air and wind to go through the embankment, removing heat from it.
Over time, something amazing happened. Year by year, the ground below got colder. Over several years, they reduced the average temperature of the ground by 2 to 3 degrees, just enough to keep it frozen. But to build a whole railway line 600 kilometers long, with concrete tubes running through it, would still be too expensive. Cheng's cheap idea wasn't cheap enough. But he didn't give up. After years surveying the plateau, he noticed that something strange was happening beneath piles of small rocks.
The reports showed the temperature under the rocks was lower than other areas.
Could this point the way to an even cheaper solution than the tubes? A report from a remote part of eastern Kazakhstan confirmed his suspicions. Archaeologists had discovered ancient tombs made from piles of small rocks. They noticed that the ground away from the tombs was soft and boggy, but under each tomb it was frozen, and had remained frozen for thousands of years, preserving the artifacts below. Somehow, these rocks were cooling the ground. Back at the research station, Cheng decided to see if an embankment built of small rocks could do the same for a railway.
The purpose of these crushed rocks is to remove heat from the embankment and from the ground below. So when they are built, they make sure there is no fine material between the rocks, leaving as much space for the air to circulate as possible.
Over just 14 months, Cheng's experimental rock embankment lowered the average temperature of the ground by 3 degrees Celsius, and he found out how it worked. In winter, cold, strong winds blew through the rocks, pulling heat out of the ground. While in the summer, the rocks shaded the embankment from the heat of the sun. After 50 years of frustration, Chinese scientists had stumbled onto a 2,000-year-old solution to the permafrost problem that was about as low-tech as it gets.
This can be almost a 1 meter thick layer that goes down the embankment, then down to the other side and up again, making almost like a U shape.
At last, Chinese engineers could start building the railway. In 2001, thousands of workers converged on the plateau and work began, building the huge embankments using local materials and basic machinery. By 2002, construction crews were rolling out the railway line at an incredible pace, thanks to another very clever but simple idea: a PG-30 locomotive, which lays its own rails as it advances. It makes building a track almost as easy as assembling a model train set. By mid-2003, the workers had laid over 250 kilometers of track from Golmud up onto the Tibetan plateau, and were making good progress towards Lhasa. But the battle with the permafrost was far from over.
Well, in some of the areas the permafrost is very warm, so that the rocks by themselves could not solve the problem. And in those cases they would have to look into alternative solutions.
In some sections of the route, the summer temperatures were just a little too warm. The embankments needed a little extra help to keep the ground frozen. An ingenious device was found that was once again very low-tech, harnessed nature, and required no power. These bizarre-looking tubes are called thermosiphons.
The idea behind this is ingenious, but really quite simple. If you have ever licked the back of your hand and blown on it, your skin feels cool. That is because the water is evaporating and that removes heat from your skin. These work in a similar manner.
Up to 10 meters long, with 5 meters buried into the ground, the thermosiphons contain ammonia, a refrigerating liquid. However, unlike a fridge, a thermosiphon doesn't need an electricity supply to work. Inside the tube, the liquid ammonia behaves a bit like the water on your skin. It absorbs heat from the ground, which causes it to boil and evaporate into a gas. The gas rises in the tube, taking the heat from the ground with it. At the top, cold wind cools the tube, and the ammonia gives up its heat to the air outside, and condenses back into a liquid, which runs to the bottom of the tube, and the cycle repeats itself. Simple, low-tech genius. 34 kilometers of track are cooled this way. But even thermosiphons were incapable of protecting the most vulnerable sections of permafrost. Passy heads to an area called Qingsu, almost a quarter of the way across the plateau, to explore the most fragile area of permafrost on the whole route.
Here, the active layer of permafrost melts during the summer, and it turns into a treacherous bog that can behave almost like a quicksand. If it turns into that kind of quicksand, you can't bring anything on top of it. Everything would just sink into it immediately.
The ground here gets too warm in summer, even for thermosiphons to cool. If the engineers couldn't find a way across this shifting marsh, there would be no railway. The answer, they believed, was to treat the bog as if it was water and build bridges. Along the route, teams of workers drilled thousands of holes deep into the permafrost. By drilling through the active layer and down into the ice below that stayed frozen year-round, they could build on solid foundations. At least, that was the theory. Because they now faced a new nightmare, and again, it was all about temperature. The concrete poured into the ground to make the piers of the bridges could destroy the very foundations they were building on.
When you mix the concrete, it goes through a chemical reaction. As it sets, it gives out heat.
In this experiment, the temperature of the mix steadily increases. When all your work is aimed at keeping the permafrost frozen, heat is the last thing you want.
The temperature here is 13 degrees. That would be enough to melt the ice around the structure and to make it unstable.
So how would Chinese DIY engineering deal with this one? By putting Mother Nature to work for them. They would build in the dead of winter, when ambient temperatures fall below freezing, and cool the concrete to 5 degrees, pouring it as quickly as possible before it sets. By bringing in thousands of workers, they built nearly 3,000 bridge piers in just 7 months. A breathtaking achievement, epitomized by one of the iconic features of the line, the spectacular 11.7 kilometers long Qingsu Bridge, the longest permafrost bridge in the world. The permafrost problem was finally conquered. In all, over 160 kilometers of the Qinghai-Tibet Railway is built on bridges like this, 1/7 of the whole route. Here, the body finds it very hard to get enough oxygen out of the air, into the blood and to the muscles where it's needed. The harder we work, the more oxygen our bodies need, and if we don't get enough, it can be fatal. In severe cases, fluids can leak into your lungs and brain and kill you. As the Lhasa Express travels over the plateau, one of the most important jobs for the crew is to keep an eye on the passengers. They're looking for signs of altitude sickness. The train is now traveling at 4,500 meters above sea level. Medical advice recommends you should take 5 days to climb to this altitude to allow time to acclimatize. The train has done it in just 32 hours. At this altitude, around 3/4 of people start to experience altitude sickness.
I can feel that the air is very thin. When I was taking pictures, even slight movements made me feel breathless.
Since Tuna River, I've started to feel dizzy and sick. My nose feels very dry, and so does my child's. He has also complained of tummy ache.
To reduce these symptoms, remember those special oxygen generators. They fill the carriages with enriched air. The oxygen generators inside each carriage use a technique called membrane separation. Air from outside the train is compressed and pumped through small tubes. The walls of those tubes are made of a membrane containing small holes, which allow more of the smaller oxygen molecules to pass than the larger nitrogen. The unwanted nitrogen is exhausted from the train via an outlet pipe, while the oxygen-enriched air is fed into the carriages. It raises the level in the air from 21% to 24%. It's not much, but it makes most people feel better. But for people who are really suffering, there is a backup system. The staff give afflicted passengers a tube, which they can plug directly into a supply of 40% oxygen. Every berth and seat on the train has its own oxygen supply. The train is not pressurized like an aircraft cabin, but the doors are sealed to keep the oxygen-enriched atmosphere inside, and there's a very slight positive pressure, so the air outside can't seep in. By comparison, for the workers who built the track, conditions on the plateau were a living hell. Hard physical labor at this altitude is not only difficult, it's dangerous.
I really feel quite fragile up here at the plateau. I have a bit of a headache, and even though I'm walking at less than regular pace, I'm completely out of breath.
Many of the 3,000 workers who died building the first road into Tibet in the 1950s died from altitude sickness. And the railway engineers were keen not to repeat the disaster. But they needed extreme structures to be built at extreme altitudes, including one in particular.
I just had to see this. This is the highest railway tunnel in the world.
At 4,905 meters above sea level, the Chinese called the Fenghuoshan Tunnel the nearest door to heaven.
I can't even imagine what people who built this had to go through. We are at the 4,900 meters, and there's not a lot of oxygen, so it had to be literally a headache to build it.
Building this tunnel required hundreds of laborers to live and work at this extreme altitude. So the railway company brought in one of China's leading experts on high-altitude medicine, Professor Tianyi Wu, head of the Qinghai Highland Medical and Scientific Research Center. His mission was to help the engineers build the tunnel and other high-altitude structures without the tragic loss of life of the 1950s road construction.
During the initial building of the Tibetan Railway, as most of the workers were from regions around sea level, they were not adapted to the highlands.
Aware of the dangers of rapid ascent, Professor Wu prepared a careful plan.
Our first measure was a stepwise adaptation, which meant letting them ascend gradually. So from inland, after the journey from Beijing to Xining, they'd stop for 3 days, and then a week stop at Golmud, then ascend to the Tanggula Mountains.
Professor Wu was supported by a vast team of 2,000 doctors and nurses. Infirmaries were built every 18 kilometers along the route to treat sick workers. And Professor Wu made sure there was a good supply of oxygen.
So despite having over 1,000 cases of severe high-altitude illness over the 5 years, no one died. The mortality rate was 0.
Thanks to the onboard oxygen supply, the crew and passengers on the Lhasa Express are travelling in relative safety. But as they cross the plateau, their lives depend on another critical safety system. To save money, the line was built as a single track, but that brings with it a constant danger. If two trains travelling in opposite directions are accidentally routed onto the same line, there could be a head-on collision. But to control the trains, there are no signals. Instead, alongside the track, every 15 or so kilometers, there's a mobile phone antenna that passes information between the train and the control center, 2,300 kilometers away. Along the route, there are crossing loops, short sections of double track where trains can pass each other. 39 hours into its journey, the Lhasa Express is approaching one of these passing points. Tanggula, the highest railway station in the world. It's a ghostly place. The station is simply a passing point for trains. It's early afternoon, and the train is still 500 kilometers from Lhasa. Inside, the passengers are protected from the extreme environment outside. But while the train protects the passengers from the environment, it must also do the reverse. It has to protect the fragile ecosystem of this ancient landscape from human pollution. The Tibetan Plateau contains the Kakashili and Sangjingyuan Nature Reserve, the second largest nature reserve in the world. It's larger than England and Wales combined. It's a delicate ecosystem that could be easily disrupted and destroyed. On most trains around the world, sewage and wastewater are dumped straight onto the track. But not here. The heat from all that water would warm the permafrost and degrade it. It would destroy the very foundations the train runs on. So the Chinese have gone green. Instead of dumping wastewater on the track, the Lhasa Express stores it in collection tanks below each carriage. Each tank holds 500 litres of wastewater, enough for 250 toilet flushes. Every night, at Golmud Station, a small fleet of mini-tankers drives along one of the platforms. At 11:45 p.m, the Lhasa Express's sister train, the T28 from Lhasa, pulls in on its way to Beijing. After crossing the plateau, the train's tanks are full of wastewater. A small army of workers leaps into action. They attach hoses to the tanks and pump the wastewater out. The whole operation takes less than 10 minutes. As the train leaves the station, the tankers head off to dispose of the waste safely. And 900 relieved passengers head off to Beijing. Passy is impressed by the efforts to conserve this fragile ecosystem. But in his trip across the plateau, he's discovered that all is not quite right with the railway. The line itself is still under threat. Despite all the efforts to keep the ground beneath the line frozen, the Qinghai-Tibet Railway is being attacked by an unexpected enemy. In parts of the plateau lies a natural phenomenon that has been here for thousands of years. Sand.
But this is quite impressive. I didn't really expect to see sand dunes up here in the plateau. It's almost like being at the beach.
The problem with sand is that unlike mud, its grains don't stick together.
If I stick my hand in here on a windy day like this, it just blows away.
And it's blowing straight towards the railway embankment, half a kilometer away.
And this is where the problem comes. The sand that has been blowing in the wind is filling up the gaps in the rock embankment.
As the crushed rock embankment fills up with sand, it loses its ability to cool the ground below. In time, this could lead to the permafrost thawing out, buckling the track. So the railway company is trying its best to stop this happening.
They have erected dozens of these fences to keep the sand away from the tracks. You can see how the sand has piled up behind the fence.
As the wind blows through the fine mesh of the fences, it slows down and drops the sand. But despite all their efforts, the sand here has already permeated the rock embankment. The sand only affects a small section of the line, but there's another much more serious threat to the long-term future of the railway, and this one is man-made. The permafrost on the plateau is extremely sensitive to changes in temperature, and global warming is slowly heating it up.
Our country has done research in this field and has given us a set of data speculating that the temperature of the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau will rise by 2.2 to 2.6 degrees Celsius over the next 50 years.
The railway is designed to cope with a 3-degree increase in average temperature. But other factors could raise the temperature far more than this. Across the continent, and particularly in neighbouring India, coal is used extensively in fires and furnaces that produce smoke containing black particles of soot. Much of that soot falls onto the snow that covers the Tibetan plateau in winter. The dark particles cause the dirty snow to absorb more of the sun's heat than clean snow. In spring, the snow now melts earlier than before, adding to the warming of the plateau. Despite all the measures to keep the railbed frozen, if the temperature rises more than 3 degrees, the railway could be in trouble. The Lhasa Express sweeps over the stunning triple-span bridge across the sacred Skyachu River. For the crew of the train, it's a welcome sight. After 47 hours, it's a sign they are nearing their journey's end. And this is it, the vast new Lhasa station. At $35 million, it's a symbol of the Chinese determination that the railway is here to stay. With this line, Chinese engineers have proved they are among the best in the world, and they've laid the foundations for an expansion program, the like of which the world has never seen. In the next 5 years, China will spend an estimated $300 billion constructing over 30,000 kilometers of new railways. For Pasi Lautala, his time on the plateau has come to an end.
Coming up here has been a stunning experience for me. I already had a lot of respect for people who built this railway, but only now I truly realize the challenges they faced. I mean, this is a tough place to work. Headaches, shortness of breath, freezing winds. Not only they got the railway built, but from an engineering point of view, it really is quite amazing.
The Qinghai Tibet Railway is a truly monumental engineering achievement, a vast labour of human endeavour and ingenious low-tech engineering that shows the way forward for new railway lines all over the world. Perhaps the start of a new golden age of railways.